I'm Sundar Katwala. I'm the director of British Future. Thanks for spending your lunchtime with us for this webinar. We're talking about September the 11th, 2001, 25 years ago already. This September, half a lifetime for some of us, more than a lifetime for some people as well. And we want to reflect on that. Now, there were terrorism attacks in New York. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives, and that is often debated as a human tragedy, which of course it was, and as an issue about terrorism and foreign policy and Osama bin Laden and Blair and Bush and the war in terror in Iraq and Afghanistan and those things. And of course that is part of the story of 9/11. But we're today in South Asian Heritage Month. We want to talk about the experience of the changes of those decades in Britain, particularly for British South Asian communities and British Muslim communities. What was the impact on people's lives? How did it shape and reshape relationships and identities? What do we learn now from that experience of the past generation going forward? We've got a great panel to bring out those themes, and please put your questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A, so I can pick some of those up when we're there. So just to tell you who we've got, and then I'll introduce them. I'm going to ask Suga Ahmed to start. She's done a great deal of work in faith education and research over this period of time. She can tell us more about that. We've got John Pandit, who's a musician, an activist, a founding member of Asian Dub Foundation, which will mean a great deal to many people across different generations. Professor Jagbir Jyoti Jahal, who's the Professor of Studies at the University of Birmingham, and my colleague Arvez Mohammed, who's leading a project that has put this event on, the South Asian Bridges Project, which is trying to have conversations within and across South Asian communities about the future we face. So, Suga, I'd like to come to you. 25 years on, it's a long time. How did it change you, and how did it change us? The experience of 9/11 and what happened afterwards.
Thank you, Sundar, and hello, everybody. A special thank you to British Future for putting this on, especially to Aves. This is a really important conversation, and to have it together in this way with co-panelists is a really wonderful way of marking that terrible tragedy, but also having a broader conversation. Obviously, I'll say up front, like you alluded to, Sundar, I'm not going to cover everything 9/11 changed for British Muslims and British South Asians. There's probably a book in there, Sundar, I think. So I've picked three things that I wanted to focus on, three shifts that I think matter most. And if I'm honest about where we've been and where we're going, these are the three things that come to mind. I'll share these, and then happy to take questions on them and focus the conversation on where people would like it to be. So first of all, 9/11 took an ethnic identity and turned it into a suspicious one, a suspect one, for a lot of people who look like me, not just Muslims, but South Asians. So before 9/11, if you'd asked most British, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, or Indians how they describe themselves, religion wasn't necessarily the headline for them. It was background, it was community, it was family. Asian, in that broad, imperfect way Britain uses that word, or used to use that word. Almost overnight, that changed. Suddenly, Muslim wasn't just a private matter of faith that you shared with your family or with your community or when you were at the masjid. It became a public category, one that came with a question mark attached to it, whether you asked for it or otherwise. I, at the time, was fresh out of university and at work right after the moment that the towers were hit. Almost immediately, I feel, those around me in my workplace began to look at me with different eyes and ask questions that I didn't know how to answer. Questions like, why do your people want to kill us? And of course, I was a little bit aghast at those kinds of things. And when those questions repeated themselves and those eyes continued to look at me in the way that they did, actually, in the end, it encouraged me to go back to university and take a master's in Islamic studies to try and understand the Islam that I knew and the Islam that they were talking about in a way that was in keeping with my own education. So I went back into academia to do that work. And it was the beginning of the rest of my life, quite frankly. That's not just a memory, though. It became a pattern that was written into policy. prevent, community cohesion, the endless quiet demands to prove you were one of the good ones. I remember that quite vividly, actually, still. An entire generation grew up being asked to audition for belonging or prove their worth. And we all know that this was a red herring, like the cricket test. All answers were the wrong answers, no matter what was said. And at the time, actually, I went on to work at a think tank and did a lot of work on young British Muslims, traveling up and down the country, talking to people, crunching that data, writing reports, and then presenting it back to central government mainly and journalism, all in the hope that they would understand those nuances that were being lost when writing policy or speaking about young people generally and the young British Muslims more specifically. Secondly, and here's the part that I think gets missed. Yes, the 25 years have included, these last 25 years have included real hostility and real difficulty for all of us in different ways. But they've also, for the British Muslim community, I would say, produced the most confident, most institutionally serious generation of British Muslim leadership this country has ever seen. Thinking about it practically, in 2015, Nadia Hussain, a name that never needs any explanation, won the Great British Bake Off in her hijab in front of 10 million viewers. And the nation, of course, just loved her. In 2016, now Sir Sadiq Khan became Mayor of London. Baroness Saida Warsi sat in a cabinet, and mosques that used to keep their doors closed to outsiders started running open days because a generation of young British Muslims decided that if people had questions, the answer was to open the door and not hide behind it. And that's exactly where projects like the Ramadan tent projects, Open Iftar, came from, feeding thousands and thousands of strangers in public open spaces, every faith and none, including in the middle of London every Ramadan. What I'm trying to say is that we didn't get handed a seat at the table. We built our own tables and then extended the invitation. We are increasingly more accepting of women and men. I'm really pleased to be able to say this in my own communities who don't look Muslim. And this means that we're starting to understand the nuances around diversity and inclusion in ways that I hope is moving us on from those early who can represent us days. Does she wear a hijab? Does he have a beard kind of rhetoric? And then the third thing I want to say, and this is the thing that I wanted to leave you all with, is that belonging in Britain has never been given. It's been built, it's been defended, and it's been claimed. So just taking a brief look at what happened in Southport in the summer of 2024, a horrific tragedy was hijacked by people who wanted to burn down a mosque and who turned up to protect that mosque, to stand in front of it, to help clean it up and clean up the glass afterwards. Local people, neighbors, doesn't matter what faith, Muslims, otherwise, side by side, actively refusing to let hatred write the story of their town. And that for me is a real inheritance of the last 25 years. Not that Britain granted us belonging as a gift, but that again and again, ordinary people, regular people, many young, many born after 9/11 actually, and only knowing this country as the one they've had to keep re-explaining to themselves. They chose to build that belonging anyway. So the three things, 9/11 turned ethnicity into suspicion. That suspicion, instead of silencing people like me or you, organized us into leadership. And belonging was never given to us. We've had to build it and we're still building it. The work for us and for whoever comes after us is making sure that the next generation doesn't have to keep refighting, re-arguing for something that should have already been settled by now. Thank you.
Thank you, Suga. That's a really interesting start. I think it's so interesting that under the pressure, heat, and polarization of this moment, you do. I think, as you say, there's a lot of discomfort there, but that sense that there is a shift then across genders, across generations in who speaks and who acts, and what we do about that. That's a good thing to link to you, John. On, I mean, you were a change maker and a pioneer in the 1990s, which I think felt to many people like quite an optimistic time. And then, this moment changes quite a lot. Tell us about your experience and how this moment made you feel and think about things.
I think you have to not first say 9/11. I think perhaps it is a generational thing. We experienced it, and watched it on television live, and for most younger people, young adults, it was before they were born, and so their experience of like the atrocity has been superseded by other atrocities, invasions, wars, genocide, attempted genocides. Sri Lanka, Gaza. So that violence of that time is something that really strikes us. And I think of it as yesterday, whereas a lot of people say, well, that was 25 years ago. So I think we've got this mindset, our generation, where it just happened, and same with 7/7. But I think it's in the minds of many young people, it's part of a wider thing. Afghanistan, Libya, where this extreme violence, whether it's by terrorists or state actors, has occurred. And if I go back to where I came from, I was involved in an organisation called Asian Action Group in the 80s. Very much suddenly, in those days, even for me, it was like a eye-opener. This is it up in North London, where just the diversity of the Asian community was something that I hadn't experienced before. South Indian Christians, people from other religions like Jains, and the very fact that when we organise a youth community group, other youth would come in, not just Asian youth, they'd come into the group as well. So it was very much, we were very open, and that thing was our mindset. And very much other community organisations where it was the elderly Asian pensioners club, we would have free meals at lunchtime. All those kind of things was going on. So afterwards, it was a slow burn in how people were sort of like see themselves, who they are. And it's taken that length of time. And what we were doing in music kind of originally in 93 was a response to, how we see ourselves as open, and we claim that, and that's a history of anti-racist movement. That's a history of Black and Asian movements historically, and we were just reflecting, and our music was reflection on that, and reflection of the diversity of the band, but the diversity of our audiences. So we just went everywhere and everywhere throughout Europe and played, and still continue to play today.
Thanks, John. I'm going to bring in Jagbir next. Jagbir, relationships are going to change, I think, across South Asian communities, from the 50s, 60s generation, the British-born generation. So we don't have the counterfactual of what would have happened otherwise. But clearly there's a rupture effect of this. What from your perspective, working within Sikh communities and across communities, how do you reflect on this moment now?
So if I'm thinking about 9/11, I'm thinking about three things. I'm thinking about racialization, how the visible religious identities have become racialized after 9/11. I'm thinking about the religious literacy, how ignorance about religious diversity has affected Sikh, Muslim, and Hindus. And I'm then thinking about community cohesion and solidarity, and how relationships in some circumstances have changed positively, but in other circumstances have changed negatively. And what we have seen is some sort of siloing of ourselves within our own community. So when we were fighting racism prior to 1990, I think we were all working together on this one common cause. You had 9/11, and I think communities kind of started to separate themselves, because I think immediately after 9/11, you saw the solidarity between Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim organizations condemning the attacks together and working collectively to kind of against that racism. However, as time has evolved, what we're seeing is that because the Muslim community is experiencing that kind of intense securitization, the other faith communities have kind of separated themselves from them. The Sikhs, I think, have also been in a very difficult situation because they've experienced mistaken identity right? So the first person to have been killed after 9/11 was Balbir Singh Sodhi, right? He was a Sikh they had a gas station in Arizona, and he was shot by a white American person because he thought he was Muslim, right? Because a turban, a bearded turban, a man was mistaken for being Muslim. And so what you have seen is that as a community, particularly Sikh men and now Sikh women who wear the religious turban, are getting mistaken for being Muslim. As a result of that, the community's kind of either moving away and kind of trying to distance themselves. We saw this after 9/11 when we had a campaign by some Sikhs which said, where they had T-shirts and logos saying, "Don't freak, we're Sikh," right? They said it was a way of teaching people through humor that they were different from the Muslim community, but they were also trying to create religious literacy. But I think a lot of Sikhs were very angry about that because it was throwing the other under the bus. And I know that Sikhs, particularly where this came out from, Sikhs in America put out a campaign then to say, no, we don't do this. We don't throw Sikh teachings do not advocate for us separating ourselves. We have to kind of join together and fight this racism and this discrimination that's going on. So but as time has evolved and as Sikhs still get mistaken for being Muslim, and our places of worship get mistaken for being mosques because somebody throws bacon at the gates or the door of the Gurdwara and everything. We're seeing communities kind of working within their own communities to try and address this the issue of this polarization and I do feel, and I'm not saying this lightly, I think there is some pockets within the various communities who are working together in solidarity to address these issues of discrimination and polarization. But there are also other pockets where we're seeing communities working within their own silos to address the issue. But I think what we need to see more of is the coming together of the communities to address the issue, because we're all affected by the same issues as a result of this 9/11 in terms of the discrimination that we're facing.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Alves now. He's my colleague now. He has been in 2 spells working on South Asian bridgings. I first met him actually when he'd written 2 plays, Hurling Rubble at the Sun and Hurling Rubble at the Moon, which was set in a sort of fictionalized Blackburn, which is where you're from, Alves, in the run-up in around 7/7. Of course, 9/11 and 7/7 are very closely fused, I think, when we think about this impact. But tell us something about your sense of how you experienced what changed and what it means for us.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sundar. It's really difficult for me to overplay what changed. For me, 2 things immediately crumbled. One was my British identity or my sense of it rather, when Tony Blair, in his first statement after the terror attacks in New York, asked the British Muslims to get their house in order. And that shook me to the core because I thought it was one house. I thought he was in charge of it. And I was rather hoping that he'd help us on that journey. And then the other thing was when the British Hindu Council made a statement, basically something to the effect of distancing themselves from the British Asian label in response to the 9/11 attack also. So my British Asianness also felt under some kind of threat. I felt as though what 9/11 forced the British Muslim community to do, the British Asian community also by consequence, is prematurely and inappropriately focus on the faith identifier. For me, prior to that, and perhaps for many of us more than would actually admit to, British Muslim, it was a private thing. You know, your faith is, for me, it was a spiritual relationship between me and my God. I didn't want to have it on a metric. I didn't want to be more British Muslim one day, less British Muslim another day, because that was totally between me and God. It wasn't something I was wearing on the street or wanted to be identified by. I was very happy being identified by my British Asian label and my British label. and sometimes even a British black label. But British Muslim was a very private thing. Because the terms of engagement suddenly changed overnight in politics and in media, we had to find the British Muslim in us, the public version of it, and take and respond to that call of engagement. Because now we were being not addressed as British Asians, but being addressed as British Muslims. To respond to that, you then had to respond as a British Muslim and find that within you. Some of us found it and scrambled for leadership positions within that. And I think, that was also a premature undoing. However, what I do want to say is what saved me in that time was similarly the British Asian community that I found in Manchester because the 9/11 attack, what it did for me is inspire me and push me into the creative world in order to exorcise and exercise some of my thoughts around that time and feelings around identity. And within that, the British Asian art scene, and by extent, and also the wider art scene in Manchester, the black art scene, the LGBTQ art scene, the feminist art scene, I felt I had a home there because they were giving me a perspective on what had happened to me through an anti-discrimination lens that applied to everybody, and it was a common struggle, and that wasn't space specific. And if I hadn't had that at that moment, if I hadn't had the British Asian art scene and the British Asian political scene more broadly put their arm around me at that moment, I think I would have been a very lost boy. So I genuinely do feel they saved my life at that moment. So where, I grew up listening to British Asian Foundation, Asian Dub Foundation, and Apache Indian. The British Asian identity meant a lot for me growing up anyway, but in that very particular moment, it meant more than anything.
Thanks, Ove. Suk, I'd like to bring you back in on this question. I mean, there's a critique there. I think you've all made about in a way a more siloed approach, but some of it's necessary, some of it's inevitable. I mean, it strikes me in particular, Muslim women found more voice and more space, often speaking as Muslim women. And younger Muslim people found more space and voice speaking as Muslims, as well as trying to do something. How do we think about that balance, do you think?
I mean, of course, empowering communities and individuals in those communities is really a bad thing. And I do think that, at least in the bubbles that I have existed in, I do see more women, not just in the British Muslim community, but in all of our different communities coming forth, particularly South Asian. And that fills me with a lot of hope. Actually, it inspires me that there are future generations who are looking at this leadership thinking this is perfectly normal, and actually many of those women would have had to work really, really hard, not to gain power, but to actually articulate their voice, which was different to the voices that they were hearing around them, often many of whom were masculine voices, male voices. And so to be able to diversify an issue, diversify solutions to an issue, or to think creatively and differently about something, many young people or women came to the fore to be able to help do that. And I think the reason that that happened is because a lot of the men in the room, as it were, had to create that space. I had to say, we don't have all the answers here. And actually, the people that are being talked about mostly from a national stage are not in this room. And so it took for a lot of proactively thinking men to say, I know a few women who need to be in this room. And that, I think, it became a catalyst to more and more young people or women coming in. I think for those of us who were women and young at the same time, at the time, it was all quite confusing, actually. I know if I speak just for myself, I thought somebody else had a handle on this at the time. I thought, well, why do you need an early 20-something-year-old coming into this space and trying to help articulate what does it mean to be a Brit, but now through these terms like Muslim, not even South Asian, not even Asian anymore. So Asian I recognize, British I recognize, but what did it mean to be Muslim? What did it mean to be a British Muslim when the national and international conversation on that subject matter was so incredibly parochial? It was so incredibly divisive and painful. And that wasn't my experience. that wasn't who I was, and it wasn't any of the Muslims that I knew. So being able to learn how to articulate that and then do it in a way that was authentic to you, but also was speaking to the national moment, I think was a really difficult thing that a lot of women were trying to do, and I think they did it really, really well.
And I guess another thing, just to stay with you for a moment, Suga, I mean, the sort of extremism, the Islamist extremism, the terrorism, and so on, a lot of people would have found out about it in that moment. A lot of other people would have known about things that were bubbling under, being contested, and so on. But there's then a shock when you've got to sort of account for where that is, in the national spotlight. We haven't got that many voices, I think, who necessarily know more about it. How was that handled? I mean, there was always an accusation of being too defensive or being in too denial, etc., about this group within the group.
I think part of the reason why that accusation was there was people felt like the voices that they were hearing were not conforming to the stereotypes that were building in their minds, and that this kind of nuance that was being presented to them was somehow sort of, mystifying what the reality was, that these people are in denial. They don't talk about their own communities in truth. And actually, what a lot of those in my generation were trying to figure out is that that's not the Islam I grew up with. That's certainly not the Islam that was preached in the masjids or any place that I've encountered. I remember thinking at work once when somebody said to me, I was scrolling after work thinking, how do I find out more information about Islam without talking to my parents and my grandparents about it? And it was after work, and a bunch of managers, I think 5 middle-aged white men, were sat in the corner. One of them was the managing director for the firm, and the others were all managers of some kind. And I was scrolling away on this site where people had left loads of comments and an eclectic mix of comments. And I remember one of the people saying to me, Sugra, what are you doing? Come and join our conversation. I said, oh, I was just having a bit of a scroll after work. And he said, oh, you're not on those terrorist websites, are you? And it kind of threw me. I felt like the chair came out from underneath me. And bearing in mind, they're all a lot older than me. And I'm thinking, they should be speaking wisdom. I mean, why encountering these things from them? And I remember saying, what do you mean? And he said, all those Muslims out there, all those terrorists. And I paused for a moment and I said, so do you mean, and that's it, the classic phrase, right? You're all right, Sugra. It's all those other Muslims that are out to kill everybody. I said, oh, you mean my parents, my grandparents, my little sister, my friends, my neighbors. Do you mean all those people? And obviously he was completely strapped for words. But those early encounters helped me to understand this is really complicated. And if you're going to articulate a voice, any voice, then it has to be the voice of authenticity, which comes with the nuance of what it means to grow up in this community, in this country.
Thanks. And I mean, the Muslim community we're talking about, 2011, we're talking about a couple of million people. I mean, more now. So it's hard to generalize. But you're a large group, but you're also a small group. Jagbir, just your thoughts on this. I mean, there are obviously always conversations going on within communities, and people aren't that interested about them. And suddenly, sometimes the spotlight is on, and you've got to decide how to have a general public conversation about the internal conversation. That's a really challenging thing for people to do, I think.
Yeah, so I suppose what I am thinking about is how, as a result of 9/11 and the increasing focus on the Muslim community through that security lens, and how the general public couldn't distinguish between Sikh men and Muslim men, for example, right? Created problems and created what I would call mistaken identity attacks, anti-Sikh hate attacks on them, and how the community responded to that. And as I've alluded to, there were some very public incidences of where Sikhs, particularly visible Sikh men, were attacked because it was viewed that they were Muslim. I think there's a model and a film actor, Waris Alawalia, in America, and he was racially profiled as being Muslim because he was a turban and a beard, and he did a Gap campaign, and I think there was all sorts of things scribbled over the posters and everything. And you then get a community who kind of thinks we don't want to be targeted like this, right? on one hand, you're showing solidarity to the Muslim community and saying, right, we understand where you're coming from, and we support you in your endeavors to address issues and everything. But on the other hand, you see them distancing themselves, and there is that now a very big focus, and I keep saying this. I feel that more and more of the communities have siloed themselves, whether it's Sikh or Hindu and everything. And we're defining ourselves. We are Sikh, right? Not the British South Asian has kind of disappeared from that narrative. And I see these campaigns in the media where they're focusing on that we don't want to be defined as a British South Asian. We want you to talk about Sikhs or Hindus or Muslims separately because of all sorts of issues. But having that conversation within the communities is difficult. I feel more and more of that conversation is being had by the women, right? Because they're understanding the issues and the nuances about relationship building and how it is important that we have to all come together. I feel that there's and I'm not trying to generalize, but I think that within particular pockets of Sikh leadership, there's a particular focus, right? We have to protect the Sikh identity. We have to protect Sikhs. But if you're protecting the Sikhs, you've also got to be thinking about it from a theological perspective, that we have a responsibility of protecting the other as well. And you cannot throw them under the bus in terms of trying to protect yourself. So I think there's a lot of that is happening. And I think one of the things that we are seeing through that siloing is that distancing from other communities and saying that the Muslim community, for example, as a result of 9/11 and the hate crime that the Muslim community experiences through anti-Muslim hatred and everything, Sikhs have also experienced it. Government has invested a lot of money within for the Muslim community in terms of monitoring and everything. The Sikh community wants the same kind of funding to be able to monitor anti-Sikh hate. What I would like to see is the communities coming together and working together and supporting each other in addressing anti-Muslim hatred, but also anti-Sikh hatred, and working together with that one pot and addressing the issues. But that hasn't happened. We've kind of separated ourselves. And whilst there are some groups and some organizations who will work across faith groups, I think there are more that I am seeing where there is more of that separation to protect one's own community and religion and identity. And I think that identity politics, as somebody's just written, is playing an important role in this.
Thanks. It's a good chance to bring John back in. I mean, I think we start with a very faith-based approach somewhat, because in the era of sort of Enoch Powell and multiculturalism and so on, I mean, the institutions don't have any relationships. They head to the faith institutions. In doing so, they probably are going to privilege an older, more conservative, more male kind of view. You're trying to break out, I think, in the culture to have a broader conversation. We flip back to faith. How do you see there's this demand to sort of know what communities want to say about themselves? How do we respond to that?
I think we have to create the spaces where communities come together, secular, safe spaces where people of all faiths, particularly in the Asian community, can come together. That's open. And if you see the decline in, I mentioned at the start, I was in a youth and community group, only a small group, but very diverse. We don't have those kind of youth clubs, community centres, art centres where people can get together. So what has replaced it, and this is the sort of the elephant in the room kind of thing, is the internet, which has broadly has polarised the debate and meant that communities talk to themselves and not outwards. So we need to have, in real life, spaces where we can see each other. The internet can, for example, this space, be useful, but it can also, we talk through machines, but as AI and everything comes in, we're talking to machines, which will further polarize the thing. The second part of what's going on is the economic crisis since 2001, since the start. This is sort of like having an effect. So people are in natural competition with each other. And they're divided up. And if they're divided up, then that's going to cause sparks. So it doesn't matter if you're poor Hindu or poor Sikh or poor Muslim, that's becomes sparks. That's where they start from. And we need to challenge that. We need to challenge the situation we find ourselves in. And also the final thing that is important, this isn't just coming out of a culture of, say, South Asian religious identity. We've got a further thing which is the right are mobilized, and what they're doing is not what they did historically was to say asylum seekers, refugees. Now what the right are trying to do is a legitimacy in this country on who you are. Doesn't matter if you've been established here for generations, it doesn't matter. So these are the things that are really having a profound effect. So it started off with refugees, asylum seekers, just like it did to the Jews at the start of the last century. These things become more. So now we're seeing what was seen on the internet, what we're seeing in day-to-day experience, where you see people in the supermarket and you overhear a little bit of racism, which I think the generation before didn't. We did in the 80s or in the 70s, but they're seeing it now, and they're thinking that further causes people to sort of like put up the barricades. And what we need to do is to create these spaces where people in real life can come together, because it ain't just going to be on the internet, and we need to have it in real life. When you meet people, it's a very different kettle of fish. What is good, though, what I've seen, say I went on a first demonstration for CND, sort of 1980 or 81. If I go down now to the anti-war, pro-Palestine marches, I've never seen so many Asian people of different backgrounds, from different relations. These things are amazing to me. I would see thousands of Asians from all backgrounds together. And this is a wonderful thing. So I think the young people are taking it forward, and that's excellent news.
I think these generational perspectives are very interesting. You've mentioned a couple of them. In the sense that I think some of us did see quite a lot of progress in our society in the 1990s, 2000s. This was a very disruptive moment. If you were there, if you're younger, you've just grown up with the legacy of this as the new normal. But then new things are happening. So I think in different ways, the generational experiences are very important. Alveza, I want to ask you something, again, just referencing the plays that you wrote about sort of both sides of town in the mill towns, sort of to the 7/7, the 9/11 7 period. I think two themes of what you were doing is you were exploring why the extremist offer, the Islamist extremism for the 7/7 bombers, the sort of BNP extremism, why it had some emotion and some, it had an offer of belonging, and it had something to offer to young men, young men and young women, but maybe especially young men. And then it was also quite symbiotic, I think, about how the different extremisms fed off each other. They needed the other extremism to be there. What's your perspective on how far we've got and how far we haven't got in either containing those things or having something better to offer people?
I think I need to talk a little bit about that symbiotic relationship. I think when I researched those plays, I knew that I really wanted to understand and humanize both characters. I think that was my motivation. I wanted to know how people who had grown up around, who looked like me, and didn't look like me, but I'd still grown up around, could become so extreme. And when I researched, people on the Muslim side, it was, it wasn't dissimilar stories. It was basically feeling othered, feeling a victim of racism, and trying to find an identity. And unfortunately, this was the identity that they'd fallen into. If it was, 20 years ago, they'd have probably fallen into similar movements that John Pandit fell into, but they weren't around. Similarly, and I think, the white working class experience was also the same, where when they were trying to find identity, when they were trying to find belonging, and weirdly, the football culture had kind of died away. There was a new culture. There was a new right-wing culture of affirmation and identity, and that's something else I found in my research. I feel as though communities need to be developed. What was missing for me growing up was, a sense of a political community that gave context to the experiences of myself growing up. I only realized that that even existed after 9/11, and those people, as I say, took me under their wings and gave me political education. But that wasn't there when I was growing up. That was a community for those people. Whether we like it or not, Hizb ut-Tahrir was a community for British Muslims growing up who were trying to find an identity. Similarly, I think we need to return to offering communities that deliver identity to young people that are safer, that are truer and more authentic to their actual identities, rather than finding themselves in first manifestations of it.
Thanks. Just looking at one or two questions and comments that are coming in. Keith would like to say, a lot of people I think feel this, that in many ways it feels that things are worse than the 70s, 80s, noughties. Not sure about the 70s myself, but certainly things don't seem to go in the right direction. How do we now organise, combat, lobby and challenge? Keith thinks it's the global right agenda. He thinks it went from UKIP to reform. Also X and the social media platforms destabilising the country, inciting hatred, violence and unrest. How do we do this while looking after our well-being? I mean, I think it's a really interesting question as to whether what's going on online is because everything's deteriorating all over the place, or whether the online thing is particularly radicalizing and sort of making visible and mobilizing, a fringe to think they're the norm. And obviously the real world and the online world, they do not stay apart. John, how pessimistic, optimistic are you about the moment and how we respond to it?
I think it's about learning our history first, the self-defense campaigns, industrially, the Indian Workers Association, these kind of like secular organizations that brought people together in their struggle. And it's the same that we need to have. Anti-racist activism, we kind of like built a wheel in the 80s, new monitoring projects up and down the country, project I was involved with in Tower Hamlets, where what we really need to do is defend, because the next stage of it, as things polarize further, is attacks upon our members of our community, and we need to defend them. And I was involved in the 80s doing that, very much anti-racist, anti-fascist activity. And we need to sort of like build those structures again in our communities. It can't be done by organizations at the top telling you, well, we must do this campaign, that campaign. It can only come from the grassroots. And we have to be aware that they will come back. It's no doubt it will come back like the 70s. And rather than fearmongering, we should just get on and organize. And those kind of things need to be done. Defend the most vulnerable people in our communities, because we know it's coming. And just like it did in the 70s, it will again now. And at the time of economic collapse, it doesn't matter whether it's the government saying island as strangers or whoever coming up with racist nonsense, it's got to be challenged. And we need to do it ourselves. So we need to create those spaces where we can actually mobilize and organize. And that way we come together and we know each other. You know what I mean? We know who we are. So I'm optimistic. I see little things that just go on, like, and it's not here in India, for example. 5 or 6 weeks ago, as a joke, they put up the cockroach party, and now they got rid of the education minister. So even the most formidable characters who are promoting a racist agenda, an anti-Muslim agenda, can be toppled. And they didn't even think that they would come to this. So that's just, and that is young people using memes, whatever art form they've got at their disposal on their mobile phones. That's what we need to start doing now.
Thanks. And I think the generation shift's again very interesting, because in a way, it will be a failure. I think we're organising to protect each individual group rather than managing to organise and mobilise to protect across the groups. And with younger people, the relationships are closer, I think. hopefully, but that gets tested under pressure. Jagbir, where are you about the sort of this sense, this very volatile sense of progress and regression?
No, I just wanted to come in on what John was saying, and he mentioned India, right? And I thought with the campaign that was going on there with the young people was very powerful, particularly where in a country where the division has been created on the lines of religion, right? Here we saw these young people coming together, whether they were Sikh, Hindu, or Muslim, they were all coming together to fight for that one cause. And it's one of what I want to see is the empowerment of the young people. And as John had mentioned, we need to provide spaces for them to have those conversations, build up those relationships, and understand one another, right? And I think that is something that is missing. You might have those relationships within school, but you also need those relationships outside of school. You need those youth centers, you need those activity arenas where you can engage with the other, encounter the other, learn from one another, and kind of realize that you share a lot of the same issues and concerns as the other. So I really want to see that kind of empowerment of the young people, but I also want to see the empowerment of women, because I think women also have a real important role to play in this arena, particularly as women when we are mothers, right, and sisters who are kind of looking out for our families and our brothers and the men within our communities. So there is an important role there. But one of the things, but what I do, and I sound very pessimistic because I do feel a sense of pessimism, because it feels like everything's going backwards. I'm going to sound old because I'm going to talk about what my father talks about, right? Generationally. So he came in the 1960s, straight into Birmingham. He was in Handsworth, behind the road that Robert Jenrick was walking down and everything. And he lived in a 3-story house, right? There were Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims, right? The men who lived all together, right? They shared their experiences, they built up connections, they had relationships. These elders still have those relationships, right? And they're really strong relationships where you will see them attending each other's child's wedding, etc. They'll go out for evening meals or drinks, right? Like my father does. I don't see that within our younger generation, right? Who might be at school and everything. Those real deep ties, I think, need to be developed and nurtured. And we need to provide that space for them. And I don't know how we do that in this economic climate where there is not much money around. But I think here we as communities need to be resourceful in supporting our young people in doing that. I say this a lot. We need less religious buildings and we need more community centres, etc. and everything. And that's where maybe some of the money from communities need to be going in. And I want to kind of, my pessimism is around social media because that amplifies a lot of misinformation and it allows tension to be created amongst communities. I was just, I saw a couple of days ago, it was an American journalist, a Washington correspondent, Javier Negro, I think it is his surname. And he posted online something about how the Muslims are taking over, right? And how churches are burning down, etc. and everything. But the picture he posted was of the Sikh Lord Mayor, Kulvinder Singh Johal, right? And I was thinking, you can't even tell whose picture you are posting, and you're trying to kind of create division. But whilst I was laughing about it, I was like thinking about it, but this is really serious as well, because this person who is a journalist has no idea whose picture he is posting or what background they are and everything. And this creates then further tension and fear within communities because like they feel that they're the unintended consequences of it. So I think there's that pessimism I have, but I do think we need to think about the activity kind of youth clubs and everything. But I also think education is really important in this, learning our own histories, but also schools have an important role in kind of helping nurture relationships, encounter, but also ensuring that our young people know about one another. right? And know the right things about one another, not the kind of the misinformation that they might see on social media, and maybe teach them about how they navigate social media to kind of pick out the false narratives and to kind of understand what actually is happening.
Thank you. Lots of different perspectives about the different gains and losses across generations. I think it's very interesting. And there's a question I'd like to put to you, Suga, Tara has posted about generational differences again. She says for Gen Z South Asians, many have only grown up in the post 9/11 world. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are under 25 or, under 30. This be your entire lived experience. So many will assume hatred against Muslim South Asians is a normal part of living in Britain after hearing stories from their parents, grandparents about what it was like living in Britain in the 70s. How can we communicate this turning point better to the upcoming generation? This wasn't always the consistent story. It's an interesting question about it's why we're here today. What is this turning point? What do we want to say about it? Hugo, any thoughts on that?
John's dog has something to say about that.
Yeah.
Sorry about this. I'm so sorry.
Suga, you have a go. John's muted.
I'm not going to be as eloquent as that dog. There's sort of a push and a pull thing going on as I consider what I'm hearing, but also the question that you've just asked. I feel on the one hand that pessimism, I do, and I think that's in keeping with wider British society, actually. I think there's a real sense of loss, and we're not able to sort of build that momentum back, whether it's around interfaith relations, whether it's around something that's even broader around the economy that affects every facet of our lives. So it's very hard to be optimistic when there are strong signals around the way in which you live your life on a day-to-day basis is challenging, it's difficult. If you're going to pick up your kids at the school gates, what are you going to encounter? What stories are your children going to tell you when they come home that afternoon or that evening? And, a lot of that is happening in my own family. A lot of that is happening in the families of people I know and I care about. And, I think, first of all, one of the things that's missing is that when it comes to leadership in all of our communities, so whether it's head teachers, executives, leaders in not just the religious and the cultural sectors, but outside in wider society, I think there's a real illiteracy around culture and faith to such a degree that it is permeating that ignorance, that blind spot, whatever you want to call it, numerous blind spots actually are permeating and affecting the day-to-day life of the rest of us who are trying to live as people of color or as people of faith or as people of a certain culture. And when you encounter that kind of ignorance over and over again, you can kind of feel almost invisible in society, that you might be performing a function because you are turning up to work or you're turning up to this meeting or you're turning up to classes, but actually the real you have to bury deep inside because nobody's really interested in hearing that. That's what I'm hearing from my 10-year-old nieces and nephews when they go to school and they come home, particularly, when I mean, it's amazing and inspiring to witness, but when they experienced how their schools rallied around the Ukraine issue, and then how their schools actually punished anybody who rallied around the Gaza stuff that was going on. And their parents were completely confused about why their kids were being treated in the way that they were being treated. And I don't think that's because the head teachers or the senior leadership team are mean or any kind of like personal agenda. I think the blind spots are so powerful that they will affect your decisions in that way. That's an entire generation, because that wasn't just where my nieces and nephews go to school. That was across many, many schools in this country. And that's an entire generation that will likely remember that on non-uniform day, when I wore my Palestine sweatshirt, I was asked to take it off in school in front of other children. And that in the playground, my mummy got spoken to by the head teacher. And actually, she was really embarrassed because all the other mummies and daddies were watching. That kind of is deep-seated sort of trauma that will probably need to be unpacked when that 10-year-old is 17, 18, 19. And then looking at that generation that was born right before the attacks and has grown up since, the 24, 25, 26-year-olds and so forth, that's a layer that's, I find actually really inspiring. And I don't want to put too much pressure on young people because we've spoken about them a lot, but that generation, I feel like, is getting on with it anyway. We had to fight to get on with it and figure it out as we were going along. That generation sees, oh, okay, you did that. Well, our world is a bit different now because a lot of it is socials. The CJP march, protests and all of that is a solid reflection of this generation that is not just in India, not just in the United Kingdom, but everywhere. They are using the resources that they have to hand to be able to articulate their voices. And more often than not, their voices are really, really compassionate, collaborative, bringing people together rather than tearing society apart. And I think we need to invest more energy into those spaces without asking them to do it for themselves. And my question would be, how do we do that? I don't really have too much faith left in that older generation interfaith space, for example. I've done it all of my adult life, and I feel quite dispirited in these years about it. But I would like to invest my energy where it's going to actually leverage other people's energy and that goodwill attitude. I'm going to assume that we are, friends or brother and sister until you prove to me otherwise. And the likelihood of you doing that is pretty much zero. Instead of you're Muslim or you might pass as a Muslim. And so immediately now you're going to have to prove to me your human worth before I'm able to treat you in a way that I would treat somebody else. That's a pretty low bar, your human worth. And so
Thank
I think the 25-year-olds are doing something different.
Thank you, Sue. I mean, there's loads of really interesting stuff there, but there are different formative moments for different generations, and the last 2 or 3 years have also been, we're talking about this moment. Now, we're nearly out of time. I just want to ask each of the panelists to give me one final thought. And just the question I put to each of you is, we're having this conversation at the end of July. We're 5 or 6 weeks away from the actual 25th anniversary of this moment. Does this conversation, or generally, is there anything you think we should be trying to get heard, get talked about in that moment, about what this one, a lens about how to think or look about this that's useful for us today? John, I'll start with you.
There's many things. I mean, just coming on from Sugra there, talking about it's at the grassroots level at schools, colleges, universities. Yeah, get involved. And I'll plug it. There's an organisation I've been involved with called the Samosa Media. And we've been doing that workshops with young people, and not prescriptive, but actually trying to no one looks at you. So, what have you got to say? Here's an environment where you can. And yeah, we have to fight against cuts and whatever. And I'm still involved with a project I was involved with right at the start called down at Bethel Green called Rich Mix Arts Centre, precisely to get those people into a space where we can together see and appreciate art, film, and just have those general discussions where it's a safe space to do so. And I do that. But in terms of anti-racist struggle, I think that's the next thing on our agenda. And the older ones who've witnessed some of this stuff, we need to be out there pushing a proper anti-racist agenda, but self-defense of our communities. I'll make no bones about it. That's where we're at. It will come soon. Once people are let down, see through reform, whatever, this tap of racism through the media, through the political parties, will not be turned off. It cannot just be turned off. And at that point, disappointment from as we see in Germany, as we see in other people, the far right really come into their own. And we've got to be aware, hey, this is going to come. But it's not something that's dispiriting. This is a challenge for us, and we should take it on. And don't be afraid to say it. And that brings all of us together to do that.
Thanks, John. So sobering thought. Jagbir, your thoughts about how we might want people to think about this anniversary?
I think for me, the most important thing I would like for us to be thinking about is how we work together, how we encourage unity in this diversity, but also create a sense of understanding and responsibility to one another, right? We are this one human family, and we might be from diverse backgrounds, etc., and faiths and countries, etc. But we are all responsible for one another. And for me, what I want to see from this anniversary is that as humans, but also as a part of the big family, we come together, we learn from one another, but we also are responsible for one another's pain, but also in terms of ensuring that everybody's rights and rights are protected, for example. So I think that coming together in this time of polarization and crisis is the most important thing for me.
Suga, your thoughts about that?
I'm curious, Sundar, about whether we can help to help, I don't know, through storytelling or something like that, help people who I've seen are out on these marches that advocate for the removal of certain communities from this country or certain kinds of people. And when a journalist or an interviewer digs deeper about why they're at the march, they actually don't know. And they're sort of buying into slogans that there really is no sort of depth behind. I'm curious about how we capture their imaginations. That clearly they are not racist. Clearly they do not hate other people in this country, but they are belonging to a certain narrative and feeling a sense of connection in that belonging. That they are seeking because they're not getting it anywhere else, and they're feeling despondent about all sorts of things that are going on around them or in their own lives. How do we come together and rise above that kind of hate in the way that we've seen in India recently and in other parts of the world? Because I think John's right. I think once Reform and other parties have done their bit and this country's realised that actually we're worse off for them, the rest of us will still be here to do the work. But I'm curious about whether there's something that we can there's some way that we can all rise above that among South Asian communities particularly, but also then how to leverage that and extend it into particularly white working class communities.
I think we'll bring people back for another webinar to discuss that. I think, 75, 90% on a good day of our society would say, Trump full on isn't something we want to see here. But there are very different people ready to march in the streets to stop that, to wanting to be heard because they kind of half agree with that, but they don't want to agree with it and so on. So it's a really interesting question about who does what. Ove's, your final thought about this anniversary and why it matters and how we might want to talk or communicate about it?
Yeah, I think it's I just like to end just by saying really that for me, what I've learned over the past 25 years, in this exploration of is it British Asian or like British Muslim, etc. For me, I really do feel, and this is coming as a man of faith and some spirituality, that faith labels aren't an authentic identifier of culture. And authentic culture is born from the cohesion between disparate groups. And whilst we've had this playing and experimentation of, whether it's ethnicity or faith that defines our culture, over the past 25 years, I'd urge people to come back to supporting allyship across groups. And that's exactly what the British South Asian Bridges project is about, which I'm managing as part of British Future. Many of us here today are associated with that as well. And I hope that those who aren't will reach out so that we can continue building that allyship.
Thanks, Ave. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thanks to our audience. This was an experiment, I think, as part of the British South Asian Bridgings project about how to have this kind of conversation. If this is the kind of conversation you're trying to have in the real world, in the places you live online as well, be in touch with us, because I think we definitely heard about the places we meet and mix and the solidarity. And we started with a tragic moment, a tragic topic of a terrorist attack, and heard about, the way, across the Atlantic, it changed the lives of so many people here in so many different ways. We need to have some confidence about difficult conversations to have and how to have them constructively. Thanks everyone for your efforts today, and do please stay in touch with us and let us know what you're doing in your spaces to take this forward. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.